Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the XDBER virtual conference. It is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Alex Mejia. Dr. Mejia is an assistant professor in the Department of Integrated Engineering at the University of San Diego. Dr. Mejia received his bachelor's degree from the University of Texas, El Paso, after which he continued his graduate education at Utah State University, from where he received a master's degree in engineering, followed by a doctorate in engineering education. Dr. Mejia is a Mexican-American working with Latino students in the borderlands. He's particularly interested in approaches that contribute to a more expansive understanding of engineering in sociocultural contexts, the impact of critical consciousness in engineering practice, and the development and implementation of culturally responsive pedagogies in engineering education. Please welcome Dr. Alex Mejia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that intro. I'm really honored to be here and talk to you about my research on engineering education. And my plan is to leave enough time at the end of the talk so that we can have some time to for some questions and answers. Okay, so I want to start by talking a little bit about me. As Abira mentioned, I was born here in the US, but I was raised in Chihuahua, Mexico, and very close to the US-Mexico border. This is actually what I call my hometown. It's a small town in Chihuahua, Mexico, in the Sierra Tarahumara, or the Copper Canyon, as a lot of people know it in English. It's a very small town. And when I was 14, because of different things, my dad passed away when I was very young. And so I didn't have, or the town where we lived, I didn't have any money to go to high school. And so it was also the time when the NAFTA treaty came into effect. And so I come from a family of farmers, and we didn't necessarily have we were not competitive because a lot of the Mexican government started to bring in a lot of corn and beans from the United States at a cheaper rate, and so we couldn't sell any of our products. And so I guess due to the circumstances, I saw myself obligated to move to the US, where I was born, and try to get an education here in the US. I came to El Paso with knowing a single word of English. And when I was about to graduate from high school, I asked my counselor, hey, I want to go to college. I want to do engineering. What do I need to do? And rather than providing me with some, applications or whatever, she gave me a pamphlet that was for a vocational school. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with going into a vocational school, and that's what a lot of people want to do. That's kind of like the pathway for them. But I wanted to do something different, and it started to click to me that I was different than a lot of my other classmates. I was not allowed to take AP courses in Texas. I was not allowed to go into a lot of different classes. I was actually, if you look at the transcript from my transcript from high school, they said shelter classes. And it was a surprise to me, because in Mexico, I was I was going to like the math Olympiad in my home state in Mexico, and the math Olympiad, and here I was seen as something, as someone who couldn't do things in general. And I was placed in an ESL program. I started to see other things, right? Like, for example, a lot of the students in the ESL program spoke more English than Spanish. Yet they had been there in the ESL track for so long. And so I persevered. I went to college. I got my degree in metallurgical engineering. I worked as an engineer, and when I was working as an engineer on different projects. That's when I started to see other things as well, the other side of engineering, where engineers were not necessarily paying too much attention to what we were doing to the communities that we were working with. I was working in the mining industry. I saw a lot of people that were becoming displaced from their areas. I saw how a lot of the times we were taking advantage of some of the people that we were working with. And it was the time when, for me, came this realization of, what do I do? Like, what am I doing as an engineer? What do I need to do to change things? And one of my cousins, she's a teacher in Mexico, and she told me, you should read this book. And she gave me The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And since then, Paulo Freire has been an inspiration to me, and his concepts of critical pedagogy is what kind of inspired the type of work that I wanted to do. So I decided to go and get a PhD in engineering education, and try to figure out ways in which, one, we could help students develop a more critical consciousness, our future engineers to be more critically conscious. And then the second piece was to understand what happened to me when I was in high school, how engineering knowledge is constructed, how it is, why is it that still in schools, right, a lot of students who come from a different background are seen as less than, okay? So I wanted to give you kind of like that, kind of like my pathway through, engineering, and why I'm doing what I'm doing now. So just a quick question here, okay? When you see these two pictures, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? And you can type it on the chat if you want to, okay? What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you see these two pictures, okay? Feel free to type it in the chat, okay? And I'm bringing this up because a lot of times, okay, when we see these monuments, right, or these places of, religious, ceremonial places, right? Yes, we think about beauty, and we think about Central and South American history, amazingness, and all those stuff, right? But I was watching one day the History Channel with my niece, and they were talking about these pyramids. And before they went on to the commercial break, this is what they said. Could it be, right? And they leave you hanging with this, wondering with this question, could it be? Could it be possible that, and then they come back from the commercial, and then guess what? They start talking about aliens, right? And it's fine, right? If you want to believe in aliens and all that stuff, right? But what it also does is that it diminishes what people for centuries have been doing. And so it made me realize that these deficit mindsets are not just in schools, they are diffused, right? They are they are in the cultural narrative, our daily narratives, where we try to dismiss absolutely anything that comes from this type of knowledge construction, this engineering work, right? And we say, could it be? Could it be that aliens did this? Because it is impossible that these communities were able to do them themselves, right? They didn't have the knowledge, and they didn't have the tools, and they didn't have the skills. So I believe that we need to recognize engineering design and engineering activity, that it's not necessarily just a cognitive process, but it is part of the human relationships of materiality, lived cultures, right? And we don't want to dismiss this type of knowledge from our students, right? Students they have accumulated all kinds of knowledge, skills, practices, right, that are historically and culturally grounded, right? But when we say, could it be, we're saying it is impossible that you are able to do this. It is impossible that anybody in your community could have done this, right? So my research primarily focuses on acknowledging these forms of knowledge and knowledge construction, because it is important for engineering, and it is important to change the narrative in engineering, okay? If we want to provide better opportunities for participation and for inclusion of underrepresented and minoritized populations, we need to expand how we value engineering knowledge, how knowledge has been gained through complex processes in the community, right? And we need to help students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, okay? So all civilizations have their own approaches to engineering practices, and it is evidenced by the constructed forms of visible, monuments or technologies or artifacts that they have created, right? But the master narrative in engineering continues to situate marginalized communities and students as lacking information and lacking knowledge in science, technology, education, mathematics, and art, right? Another clear example of this deficit perspectives comes from language, right? I was one of those that were affected by this perception that because of my language barrier, I was not able to do math or science. But in reality, it was up to the teachers to think about how can we integrate language and content to provide those opportunities for these students to, students like me, to continue to learn STEM. And I think that that is something that is very problematic, because when we think of STEM, a lot of the times we think about content and language being completely separate things, right? But we never think about how we can integrate those things, okay? So this is more of a research / call to action, right? Of how do we need to reframe how we do STEM education. It is also important to remember that knowledge construction doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? It doesn't only happen in the classroom. It is facilitated by a lot of the time socialization processes that happen either in the community, at home, and informal spaces, right? So knowledge construction is not just a cognitive process, but it is a social cultural process. And that is how, we learn to talk, to behave, to think, to do, et cetera, right? But in engineering, for example, which is my area of expertise, if we don't try to demystify that, what we're saying is only certain forms of knowledge are valuable in this space, and anything outside of that space has no place here in engineering. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, social cultural practices a lot of the times are devalued in a lot of different spaces, including in engineering. In engineering, we don't necessarily see a lot of examples of, for example, the Incan road, right? We don't see a lot of examples that talk about the numeric system that was used by the Mayans. We don't acknowledge what they have contributed to the science, right? To the science, technology, engineering, right? And a lot of the times, like I said before, the curriculum materials don't portray engineering in ways that are of interest to the students, right? They don't see themselves reflected in these materials. Pedro Noguera, Dr. Pedro Noguera, he refers to this as the pobrecito syndrome, right? Pobrecito means in Spanish, kind of like poor little person, right? Poor little boy, poor little girl. And these deficit perspectives lead to the idea that students need to be fixed, right? Or that they have certain inadequacies when they that come from the home, right? And how does that also portray the home as being completely inadequate for the child, right? And rather than looking internally and critically, right, we need to analyze what we're doing wrong when it comes to increasing the participation of minoritized populations, right? And with this idea of the pobrecito syndrome, right, a lot of the times we have teachers that are very well-meaning, right, but they don't expect a lot from their students. That happened to me, right? And even after I graduated high school in 2003, so even after all this, almost 20 years, I continue to see that in a lot of classrooms, where there's still low expectations for some of these students, right? And a lot of the times, these lower expectations of the students is in the form of sympathy, but we need to be more critical about what we're doing in our classrooms, and how we can change that narrative. Okay, so again, because my area is in engineering education, I believe that engineering practice is representative of a much larger engineering discourse that needs to recognize and affirm the social, the cultural, and the historical norms and tools that are situated in everybody everyday life. We need to change the conversation from what knowledge do these students, I'm primarily focusing on Latino students, need to succeed in engineering, to what is it that these adolescents or these Latino students offer to the construction of engineering knowledge. We need to start recognizing students as holders and creators of knowledge. Okay, but why should we care about this? Well, because it is going to help us to confront our own deficit perception of minoritized students. And that is not just in the classroom, but even in the type of research that we do, how we frame the questions that we're asking. It is also we need to care about this, because we need to, like I said, recognize students as holders and creators of knowledge. And also because we can build on this asset-based methodological approaches to create more culturally responsive education in our classrooms. So this brings me to my my main work, which is on asset-based approaches to engineering educations. Today I'm going to talk primarily about funds of knowledge and culturally responsive education, and talk about what we have observed in some of the classrooms that we have worked with. We're currently working with a lot of teachers in the borderlands. So funds of knowledge, maybe a lot of you are familiar with it, right? But funds of knowledge is a research approach, and it's also a framework that looks into the assets of students while challenging the deficit notions. A funds of knowledge approach tries to recognize historically accumulated bodies of knowledge, skills, practices, and cultural ways of interacting and doing with others. Primarily that emerge from community and the household. The idea is to, or the initial idea with funds of knowledge was to think more positively about the households where the students come from and the communities where they come from. This emphasizes, for example, like labor history, knowledge that is created from medicinal folk medicine, from agricultural practices, from construction practices, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. One thing that I want to point out from funds of knowledge is that it accentuates a positive and realistic view of the household, right? That tries to highlight the good things that come from from working class families, and try to challenge this idea that they are actually, framed or stop framing this household as being disorganized socially or deficient intellectually. Okay, another way in which you can see this deficit model is in the, I don't know if you've been to like Barnes and Nobles, maybe not lately because we are in a pandemic, but you go to this section where they sell these books about the 300,000 words that your kid needs to know before it comes to preschool, right? That is already, portraying these families that are bilingual families as being completely inefficient in providing the tools for the kids to be successful at an early age, like in kindergarten, right? So again, funds of knowledge, these approaches are more critical, and they try to challenge these ideas. Okay, So funds of knowledge are primarily characterized by kinship, by social networks, and by exchange. As I mentioned before, one example is, folk medicine. Another example is the acequias that we had here in the Southwest primarily. There's not a lot of water. And so families, Mexican-American families, try to collect the water and carry the water to places where they could actually, engage in agricultural practices. So that is accumulated knowledge that is valuable, that helps the family thrive, and that a lot of the times is very well aligned with engineering practices. So when I was working on my dissertation and my PhD with the support of an NSF grant and under the direction of Dr. Amy Wilson Lopez at Utah State University, we started to look at how funds of knowledge align with engineering practices. And we try to, the goal for this, in my dissertation, was to show that funds of knowledge can act as a bridge to connect the formal learning space and then formal learning space, right? So we looked at different engineering practices, like the scientific and mathematical knowledge that the students gain from, for example, plant behavior and environmental observations to improve crop production. When it comes to systems thinking, right? So how they thought about local raw materials and processes to build a stove, for example. When it came to the use of tools, they knew how to use a lot of tools, like, for example, for measurements, for carpentry, for agricultural purposes, like I said before. There was also the ethical considerations and the empathy that are so important that we're trying to highlight in engineering, right? And that was through providing like affordable solutions to their communities, to vulnerable communities. And so as I was working on my dissertation, I also noticed, though, that the students were not necessarily appreciating these funds of knowledge, right? And one of the reasons is because in the classroom, we don't highlight them. We don't say, that is great, that is important, that is good. We don't value it, right? We don't know how to elicit those funds of knowledge. And so once I started to work on other projects, I thought, okay, what can we do with the teachers so that we can co-construct together with the teachers and help them see the value of funds of knowledge so that they can bring it into their classroom and facilitate these conversations with the students when it comes to STEM practices. So we came with this Aprende project, which is an asset-based approach to engineering design. And we try to provide a professional development to a cohort of teachers. And we try to infuse it with engineering design, with funds of knowledge, and at the same time with some language practices, right? So we wanted for the teachers, because we're working with a school that is primarily emergent bilinguals, that they could integrate language with STEM content, right? So with this Aprende project, we got together with middle school teachers, and we told them, okay, we want to make sure that we're working with primarily emergent bilinguals, right? And one of the reasons is because the children are not typically assessed for their content knowledge when entering to US schools. They're actually placed in classes depending on their English proficiency. And we wanted to provide those students that are emergent bilinguals with an opportunity to continue to learn about STEM, and not make it, I mean, this is an issue of access and equity, right? To being able to provide those opportunities for the students. So 9 teachers were recruited for the project. And it is in a predominantly Latinx area here in San Diego. And it's a Title I school where about 88% of the students qualify for free or reduced lunch. And I think it's about 60% of the students who are emergent bilingual. So it's a very large student population. We worked with the teachers and we wanted to co-construct with them because we don't know their classrooms. We wanted them to tell us what is happening in your classroom. How can we contribute with what you're doing? And so we started to see how the teachers started to integrate more of this scientific and engineering practices particularly related to the next generation science standards, to their curriculum, and then they started to integrate also the language piece. We noticed how the students started to really like to create their own scientific experiments, for example. They also worked on engineering projects, right? So identifying a problem, going to their community and look at what is out in their community, thinking about their own funds of knowledge, right? So thinking about how do I recycle my own materials? This was a project on an engineering project on creating a more efficient recycling process. And so they thought about how do we recycle things? What are some of the practices that we bring from home? How do we make it more efficient, right? So they walked through the whole process. And another thing that we noticed was that the teachers, they started to appreciate a little bit more the translanguaging that a lot of the times happened in their classrooms, right? Because they were using translanguaging themselves to make sense of what engineering is. These are teachers that don't have training in engineering, but they are asked by the state or the district to integrate engineering into their classes, right? And so we started to see how, in order to make sense of things, they started to draw from those linguistic practices to actually make sense of what they were doing in the classroom and how they were preparing these materials, right? So translanguaging allowed teachers to want to engage in sense making for a known concepts, to expand a vocabulary, provide context, provide descriptions, and also transmit that information for the students, right? It also helped them to gather, synthesize, and analyze information. And these are things that we do in engineering. And so if we start to appreciate more the translanguaging practices that happen in the classroom, maybe we're opening a door for a lot of these students to engage in STEM education, right? And also it helped them to further solidify ideas, right? So they started to do research on Lean Six Sigma and sustainability, engineering models, right? And a lot of that came from, Spanish, finding that information in Spanish. So teachers, I think that something that happened here is that they did not feel restricted by the classroom social and political boundaries. They created their own space to engage in practices like this. And something that the teachers reflected on was that in their own classrooms, a lot of the times they are required to speak in English to the kids, even if their language proficiency it's not to that level, but they're required by state to talk to the students in English. And so they started to reflect more on some of the constraints of the classroom itself, the political boundaries created by the classroom. And one of the teachers, Rocio, in this case, mentioned that if it helps the teacher gather their thoughts and communicate clearly their ideas, it certainly helps the students, right? So they started to, again, get rid of some of those deficit mindsets. Now, because I want to leave enough time to talk about this. Some other findings that I'm going to go through this kind of quickly just so that we have enough time for a conversation. But when some of the things that the teachers reflected on as well was how funds of knowledge can help students feel more comfortable talking about doing STEM related activities, right? So Rebecca, who was one of our teachers, she said that it made the students feel more comfortable engaging in discussions because their classroom content was designed around topics they were more familiar with, right? She said that, she said, we are building more on what they already know, and they can bring more ideas from the things that they have done. We had another teacher that said, STEM related subjects, right, can definitely start to feel more comfortable for a lot of the students because some of the ideas are more attainable for them. They see it as more tangible, right? They're more connected to things that they already know, right? Another teacher talked about how they play a major role in the establishment of the classroom culture, and in allowing these conversations to happen, right? That they started to think about, the times when a simple comment, right, can become a whole revelation for the students. And that was very important for them. And another thing that the teachers also reflected on was that they do a lot of the times capitalize on their backgrounds and on their personal anecdotes to establish that classroom culture, right? We had a lot of students that were from this same region. And they said that those experiences was really helpful for the students. So this is also another call to action to make sure that the teacher, the teachers that are teaching our students in our classrooms also, that we start to bring in more different perspectives into the classrooms. We need to bring more teachers. Diversity in that sense is very, very important. Okay. Now, teachers talked about funds of knowledge as being really important and providing a lot of empowerment for the students, and recognizing the students' backgrounds, right? That there is importance in recognizing that to make STEM more relatable. But there's also still some things that we need to work a little bit more, right? We started to think about maybe working with in-service teachers. It's already too late. Maybe we need to start working with our pre-service teachers to start bringing in these ideas at an earlier point, because the teachers are already embedded in this structure, and they can see that there's a lot of institutional obstacles that and a lot of challenges that they need to overcome. For example, that there is a particular curriculum that they're dictated by law to to provide to the students, right? They felt like they wanted to do a lot of these things in their classroom, but they are constricted by the classroom itself, right? And there's definitely still a lot of more work that needs to be done when it comes to working with the teachers. A lot of the teachers saw Spanglish as something to be avoided a lot of the times, right? And it contradicted a lot of the times the empowerment and the recognition of students' backgrounds that they were highlighting throughout throughout our project. So there's definitely still a lot of things that we need to to talk about, because even though they recognized the value of funds of knowledge, there were times when they ended up talking about some contradictions, right? And then the most important thing that I think we need to continue to work on is how we as researchers are positioning the teachers, how the district itself is positioning the teacher, how the school itself is also positioning the teacher, because it is important for the teacher to decide, how am I going to position then myself based on how these other different entities are trying to position me. I'm not an engineer. I'm not teaching engineering. My background is in science, or my background is in math, or my background is in language arts. How do I do that, right? So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of how can we make this effective for everyone. So just to close this up, asset-based practices can be used as a vehicle to the world of engineering, and it can be used also as a vehicle to the world of chemistry and biology and mathematics, right? Particularly in engineering, an asset-based approach can help students think about how they frame problems, how they solve problems, how they ideate, how they evaluate problems, and then how they implement solutions into their communities. We need to stop, at least in engineering, to think about how we frame success for a lot of our students. A lot of the times is, in order for you to be successful, you need to leave your community and go and get a job at Exxon, or go and get a job with BP or Lockheed Martin. And a lot of these students actually want to contribute to their communities, and we're not allowing them to develop that healthy engineering identity a lot of the times. So some of the significance of this work, I think that I already talked about some of the significance, but I think that the primary significance of this project is that we have an opportunity to conceptualize engineering in different ways and let the students conceptualize it in their own terms, but also for us to change the engineering discourse and how we talk about engineering in our classrooms. So I obviously want to thank the National Science Foundation. This comes from different grants that I've been working on. I want to thank you all for listening to me ranting for 30 minutes. And I will open the floor for any questions or anything you want to talk about.
Thank you, Dr. Mejia, for an interesting and reflective talk. So I'll read a comment from Emily Atia, and if I pronounce your name incorrectly, please, I'm apologizing in advance. She says, this is a really great point in physics and chemistry. I remember learning a fair bit about contributions to the ancient Greeks, which was valuable, but it really, if ever, extended beyond Greek history. I think it gave the idea that the ancient Greeks were the only civilization engaged in this type of work.
Correct. Yes, definitely. I agree with that.
Kim Castgens stated that many or perhaps deeper research studies that deal with STEM skills and understanding, as opposed to effective attributes, do not report findings broken down by a race or ethnicity. Do you think it would be helpful or harmful to encourage such data to be collected and reported?
I think that it depends on how it is collected and reported, right? Because let's say, for example, I want to do funds of knowledge research in a quantitative form. Most of my work is in qualitative, right? But if I wanted to do in a quantitative form, then it becomes kind of tricky, right? Because then you're providing a hierarchy of knowledge and then you start to provide value to certain types of knowledge as opposed to exploring how funds of knowledge are not necessarily bounded to by culture. They actually evolve throughout time, right? And there's a lot of the times also when some funds of knowledge, people have learned how not to use those certain forms of funds of knowledge in specific places. So I think that it really depends on how it is reported and how it is done. I think that as long as it is done in a critical form, in a critical way where you're not necessarily essentializing culture, but trying to think more broadly about how social cultural practices can serve as a bridge to connect formal and informal spaces, then I think that then that is a completely different story than in trying to become the funds of knowledge seeker, for example.
So Clarissa Keene states that amazing talk, few questions. As a white monolingual English-speaking teacher, are there suggested ways to incorporate other languages and cultures in the classroom in an authentic and appropriate way?
Yeah, so I think that there are different ways to do this. You can collaborate. Well, first of all, don't do everything at once, right? That's what we told our teachers that we were working with, right? Don't try to do everything at once. Start with a little module, start with a little activity, something that becomes important for the students. It could be like even in the form of an extra credit, right? And then you can start building up on that and then create kind of like your own repertoire of what you're doing. I think that it's also important to do it in a respectful way, right? I would say try to collaborate with maybe you have other colleagues in maybe like in the Spanish or French or whatever, right? I would say collaborate with them, talk about your ideas. The project that we're doing right now with the teachers, we're not imposing onto the teachers what to do. We see it as a co-construction. We bring our expertise in engineering, we bring our expertise in language integration with STEM, and then we let the teachers explore the ways in which they can do it in little incremental steps. So I think that co-construction, that co-collaboration is very, very important if you want to do this in your classroom. And it is something that everybody can do, right? It's going to take time. You have to embrace that ambiguity that might come with it, but it's definitely doable.
So her second question is, I have considered having visiting lecturers, but ideally that would be compensated. Does anyone have experience gaining funds of this type of curriculum reform?
I'm also letting anybody speak because I don't have all of the answers, but if anybody has, has done that in the past, I mean, it would be great if you could also share that.
I'm going to go on to Matthew Yu. He says, great talk. I have a question. Discussing deficit mindsets entails a lot of vulnerability. From the PhD facilitator perspective, how do you go about establishing norms that would encourage teachers to critically control and reflect on potential deficit mindsets?
Ooh, that's a difficult one. And I think that one of the reasons is because they're also wearing a lot of hats at the same time. In trying to confront those deficit mindsets in the classroom is a lot of the times, like for example, with our teachers, they see it as going against the norm of the school or what the school is asking them to do, right? Like for the example that I provided about Spanglish, right? Using Spanglish in the classroom. I think that what has helped a lot of the teachers to be more reflective on what they're doing. In the professional development that we gave to the teachers, we try to allow them to think about their own funds of knowledge and how they bring that into their own classroom, because then that helps them to reflect on other types of knowledge that they also bring into the classroom and how it can help mediate some conversations. I think that allowing them to engage in those difficult discussions and in safe spaces is also very important. A lot of the times the teachers have to, like I said, navigate the system. They don't know how to navigate the system. In allowing them to express their own doubts and how they want to do better. I think that it's important, and I hope that different schools throughout the nation can actually allow for these conversations to happen.
So Paul Valander asked, oh, I'm 1 second. Okay, so has there been any effort to infuse the funds of knowledge approach with scientific texts in the classroom, specifically within secondary and adopted primary literature?
Yes, I believe that there has been some people doing this kind of work. I know that Elizabeth Moji has done some of this research. Calabrese, Barton, and Tan. Martha Civil from Arizona. I think she was in Arizona last time I checked. But yes, there's definitely other researchers that have tried to bring in or infuse funds of knowledge with scientific texts in the classroom. Primarily, if you go into or if you look for literature on literacy in secondary education or in science education, you will find definitely a lot of ways in which people have done this. I also have done it with teachers, not necessarily in secondary schools, but like in primary schools. We take like books, like regular books that they're reading about it. We try to find a problem that is being discussed in the book itself, and then we stop reading at the point where the main character is supposed to solve the problem. We ask the students to then start thinking about how they could solve the problem, and then we read the rest of the book to kind of like see what was the approach that the main character in the book took, and the approach that we took. We start to discuss conversation, we start to have conversations about how engineering designs look differently, but they also fulfill the same purpose, trade-offs, things like that. And some of that work has also been done in science education. So there's definitely a lot of resources. I'll be happy to provide them. Those are the ones that come to my mind right now.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question because it's already 9:45. So from Yassine Bridge-Mohan, how do you incorporate this in a practical way, both from a policy perspective and a procedural perspective?
Okay, so we have done it already at the undergraduate level. Obviously, our teachers are doing it in the middle schools, but for example, at the undergraduate level, we created a whole new course where we try to talk about thermodynamics concepts through a more culturally responsive lens. And by bringing different funds of knowledge from the community, we have conversations with our Native American liaison at the on campus, try to bring some indigenous perspectives into the classroom. And then, we just have conversations about, like I said, valuing these different forms of knowledge into the classroom and into the knowledge construction in engineering. And I'll be happy to share that with you if you're interested. I know that we're limited on time.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mejia.